Welcome to the 21st OECD Spatial Productivity Lab meeting. My name is Wes Vermeulen and I'm an economist at the OECD Trento Centre. Today we'll talk about regional productivity reviews featuring 3 case studies, one from Basque Country in Spain, the United Kingdom, and from Trentino in Italy. We have a very fantastic lineup of experts. First, we have Raquel Ortega-Argiles, Professor of Economics of Manchester University and Director of the Productivity Laboratory of the Productivity Institute in the UK. Then we have Maria José Araguren, General Director of Orchestra, which is the Basque Institute for Competitiveness in Spain. We also have James Wilson, who is the Research Director of the same institute, Orchestra. And we have Carlo Menon, who is an economist at the Trento Centre for Local Development of the OECD. And we have Rudiger Arendt, who is the Head of Economic Analysis, Data and Statistics Division, who will close for us today. I invite all viewers to use the interaction tools to ask questions to our speakers. Our speakers will aim to answer them as we go during this webinar. And if time allows, we can also take up some of the questions in our panel discussion towards the end. So before diving into the 3 cases, I first wanted to ask Mario and Raquel to tell us a little bit more about the demand side of the productivity reviews. From where did the idea of such reviews originate and to whom are you directing it? So perhaps I can ask Marie-Jo to start and then we'll move to Raquel.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Marie-José, Director of Orchestra. And Orchestra was created and launched on the 2006 to do research in order to contribute to the improvement of competitiveness and the well-being of the Basque Country. So from the beginning, the idea was to bridge the knowledge and to bridge the needs of the society and the capacities that we have to do research at the regional level. So the Institute was created for this. And what I would like to underline about the demand side is that the demand has been sophisticated during all these years because of the relationship that we strengthened with the different stakeholders in the territory, with the provincial councils, but also with the Basque government, the companies, and so on. What I mean is that at the beginning, what we started doing mainly analysis of competitiveness of different factors of productivity, innovation, human capital, and so on, and to present this analysis and reports to the policymakers to help to define programs, policies, and so on. But we realized that many times the technical reports are not enough to generate change processes. So there were many barriers for the implementations of the ideas that we had on the report. So we learned also on the dialogue with the stakeholders that we need also to work in a different way to improve in the how we do research in order to be efficient in generating these change processes in the territory. And that's why we are now working much more on different projects with the stakeholders that they are not just asking us analysis, but also new frameworks, new theoretical approaches, and so on to generate structural changes and mindset changes. And also there are many challenges on the governance issues, on improving the collaboration and coordinations of different territorial levels and collaboration among firms and companies and so on. So we are also facilitating many change processes through the relationship with the stakeholders.
Excellent. That's very interesting. It's interesting to see that it's both public and private coming together here to ask something with you, to define your job, so to say. So it's very interesting to see. Raquel, same question to you. Like, where does this idea or this need for doing the regional breakdown of productivity indicators, productivity analysis come from in the UK?
So the Productivity Institute is a very large investment from the ESRC, UK Right Council, so the central government of the UK. And the UK scorecards, they were very much initiated by part of the Productivity Institute, what we call the Regional Productivity Forums. The regional productivity forums were constituted by the Productivity Institute. There are 8 regional productivity forums, and they cover different geographies across the UK. among the stakeholders that are part of that regional productivity forums, we can find academics, industrialists, and policymakers. And actually, the greater interest of the scorecards was coming mainly from policymakers, stakeholders, that they found that they didn't really have the capacity, the internal capacity to develop these data tools that sometimes in terms of technical sophistication, they are not very technically sophisticated, let's say, but the time consuming of collecting data that allows, comparison between different territories and geographies across the country in some of these drivers of productivity I'm going to be talking about in a very short time, it appeared to be very difficult for them. So part of the stakeholders in our regional productivity forums are also some sites of the National for Statistical Office of the UK, and those local sites of the ONS really help us also to co-create and look for the best indicator at different levels of geography.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, it's interesting that you're also contributing to actually developing the statistics, not just rehashing them or trying to visualize them in a certain way that can be useful, but actually actively finding the indicators that can be helpful and developing them. All right, so thank you for this introduction. I think now we know why we're doing all this work. So the first stop that we're going to do is to have James Wilson present the work that Orchestra has been doing on the productivity analysis for the Basque Country. James, up to you.
Thanks very much, Vessel. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to have the opportunity to talk a bit about the regional analysis that we have been doing in Orchestra to support the competitiveness. If I could move to the next slide, please, just to kick off. Yeah, so the title of the talk is Competitiveness for Wellbeing. I think that emphasizes the idea that Mariko has already mentioned. We have a very clear mission or explicit mission in Orchestra to conduct research on territorial competitiveness that can be actioned to improve well-being. So we are understanding and analysing productivity and other drivers of regional competitiveness from a broader perspective that looks at how that positions within an overall progress of well-being. So what I wanted to do in this brief talk was, first of all, give you a little bit of a flavour for the overall framework that we're using in Orchestra to try and position our research, and then to give some examples of the types of specifics that we're looking at and how they are and how they're having impacts in terms of policy. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Sorry, the previous one. Yes, that's the one. So as I said, Mariko's mentioned our mission. So all of our research at Orchestra is very strongly policy-oriented. We work closely with a wide range of stakeholders, from the regional government to the provincial councils, the city governments, businesses, universities, etc., in the Basque Country, around trying to understand the roles they play in competitiveness. And we do that through a large range of projects. We have usually each year between 30 and 40 live projects with different stakeholders ongoing. But those are supported by two, what I call here, umbrella tools, two key tools that kind of provide the foundations for a lot of our research in the Basque Country. One of those is a data observatory, an online data observatory. In fact, we have several different observatories. This is the broadest one that looks at a range of around 40 indicators on regional competitiveness, compares them across NUTS 2 regions at European level. So we have an online data observatory which we use as a basis for fueling a lot of our analysis and projects, and then we produce each year an annual competitiveness report. As Mariko mentioned earlier, initially when Orchestra began, these reports were kind of technocratic. We would do the reports and then we would pass them on to policymakers, and we might have impact, we might not have impact. It was kind of a linear process. But what we've learned during the kind of 14, 15 years that Orchestra has been working is that a more interactive research phase with stakeholders actually helps us to design and produce research that's likely to have more impact. So this annual competitiveness report, and you can see the last 4 years there, is a report that's produced by our researchers in orchestra, but we interact with stakeholders from the beginning in terms of designing the themes we want to study, the themes that are most important for the Basque Country at this point in time, through to receiving feedback on different drafts and on different analysis within the report, through to presenting it at the public at a big conference which we have in November each year to present that year's report, and then following that through to a whole range of bilateral meetings that we have with different stakeholders to talk about the implications of the report for their actions, etc. So we see it as a really instrumental tool in terms of bringing the basic research we do on competitiveness to practice and having policy impact. Underlying both the observatory and the report is the framework that I mentioned, a framework which seeks to position competitiveness within this broader notion of well-being. So if we go to the next slide, I can briefly tell you a little bit about the theoretical influences for this framework. It's a framework that we've been developing over many years in orchestra. It has strong roots in traditional frameworks, traditional theories of growth, traditional theories of competitiveness, the frameworks that are used by World Economic Forum, the OECD, Michael Porter's Diamond Framework, etc., and the more regional turn, things such as the EU Regional Competitiveness Index. So we take various roots from that traditional competitiveness analysis, but we also look to some of the new directions in competitiveness, the work of people who have tried to move beyond a purely economic focus on competitiveness and try to understand the relationship between competitiveness and different dimensions of well-being. In particular, the framework's influenced strongly by the literature on sustainable development and well-being, kind of beyond GDP frameworks, initiatives such as quality of life measurement, the Better Life Initiative, Agenda 2030, etc. So we try to position the economic dimension of competitiveness within a broader understanding of sustainable development and well-being. And I think, being a regional competitiveness institute, our framework's also strongly influenced by the evolutionary economic geography literature and understanding of institutions and the roles that they play, and in particular around innovation. So these are, if you like, the four kind of main roots of the framework that we use. And on the next slide, you can see a depiction of what that framework looks like. It's not a linear understanding of regional competitiveness. It embraces, if you like, the complexity that lies behind trying to understand what drives regional prosperity and regional well-being. In the center of the framework are, if you like, the results or outcomes that we're trying to understand. We're trying to understand, on the one hand, the bottom four blocks are the more typical dimensions of economic business performance that are associated with economic competitiveness, so productivity, profitability, innovation, entrepreneurship, internationalization. But what really interests us, I think, from an outcome perspective, is how those economic dimensions interact with and drive different dimensions of well-being. So we position them at the same level in this framework in terms of understanding of results. And there we can identify a series of different dimensions of well-being from the literature that we try to isolate there. Then on the right-hand side of the framework, we have a series of what we call dynamic levers for competitiveness. These are the areas where policymakers and firms and other actors in the region can act and can actually do things where their behavior can change the results. And so we there use things such as natural capital, physical capital, finance, knowledge, human capital, social capital, etc. These are the, if you like, the capitals that impact on the end results of competitiveness. And finally, on the left-hand side, recognizing that each territory, each region is very different, we understand both the results and the levers need to be analyzed in the specific context of the region. So we can look at structural context, issues such as the geography and demography of the region, the business structure, institutional structure and values, etc. So we use this framework in three main ways, I guess, in our research in orchestra. On the one hand, we use it as a fairly simple diagnostic framework to try and structure our analysis so that we can present it and communicate it in a way that makes sense to different stakeholders. But again, as Mariko mentioned earlier on, we increasingly use it in a reflection action frame to try and help stakeholders understand how their actions can lead in different directions. So we try to think about the directionality behind this framework. If we're looking for particular outcomes in terms of environmental change, for example, or greening, you know, which are the key levers and how can they be pulled in the direction of a greener competitiveness? So we can imbue different directionality into the framework. And then thirdly, we use it to structure our own research questions to try and understand the relationships that exist between different actors, between different factors within the framework. And what I wanted to do now for the rest of the talk is talk you through a few examples of the types of research and the type of results that are coming out of our use of this framework. So on the next slide, you have a very preliminary result from this year's competitors report, which is not published yet. It's currently in print and will be published in a couple of weeks' time. And here, this just gives an example of one of the indicators of the economic dimensions of competitiveness that we analyze, which here is labour productivity. And you can see in this graph, for example, the approach we take to analysing the Basque Country's performance in comparison with the EU average, with the Spanish average, with the German average, and also with two reference regions that have very similar industrial structures to the Basque Country. So we select Baden-Württemberg and Upper Austria as regions that are structurally quite similar to the Basque Country in terms of their industry, and therefore are useful benchmarks for us to think about. This is one analysis of labour productivity, but it sits alongside 17 other indicators on business economic performance and another 18 indicators on well-being performance. So what we find is by doing this analysis of the evolution and comparison of the Basque Country amongst essentially 36 different indicators in the results part of the framework, we get a holistic understanding of what's happening. And we can see, for example, that in 2020, when labour productivity fell in the Basque Country considerably more strongly than it did in any other region, including in Spain, we can cross-reference that across our analysis in other indicators to try and understand what was driving that. In this case, it's largely because employment in the Basque Country maintained itself more strongly during the pandemic, and in particular the cooperative movement, etc., chose to reduce wages rather than to reduce employment. So we can gain that kind of holistic picture, and that's what we try to do each year in our report by taking this broad analysis across a wide range of different indicators. The next slide has a reflection from last year's competitiveness report on those results, kind of trying to summarize a little bit the key results that we found across the 36 different indicators that we analyzed in terms of results. And we can see, for example, that on the positive side, we see strong improvements in GDP per capita, business profitability and exports in terms of economic performance. But that's kind of counterbalanced a little bit looking to the future by fairly negative performance in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship indicators. So we can try to analyze, a strong performance today, as in last year, but weaknesses pointing to the future in terms of how our SMEs are innovating and underlying entrepreneurship indicators. So again, we try to use the broad range of indicators to develop a more nuanced picture of what might be happening and why. In terms of well-being indicators, there's again strong performance in indicators related to learning and environment, but interestingly, there was weaker performance over the last few years in terms of the economic dimensions of well-being. So whereas the GDP per capita, business profitability, exports are rising, we're seeing that actually things such as median household income or unemployment rate, more economic dimensions of well-being are not performing so strongly. So it opens up questions there about whether the results of the economic performance of firms in the Basque Country are arriving with the population or arriving with people in terms of in terms of household performance, etc. So this type of, again, cross-sectional analysis or dashboard type analysis enables us to, as I say, develop quite a nuanced understanding of what's happening and to contribute to the debate in the Basque Country about what policy should be doing in different areas. The next example is again from last year's report. I mentioned that we analyse the left-hand side of our framework looks at the structural context of the region. Well, last year's report was dedicated to understanding that left-hand side of the framework, and we analysed 3 key dimensions of the structural context of the Basque Country to try and draw policy conclusions around them. Firstly, the demographics. We saw that the Basque Country has a strongly ageing population, far more strongly ageing population than comparative regions, which provides for a certain concern from a policy perspective. We also saw an analysis of values and attitudes amongst younger generations, and this was an analysis that was proposed in a sense by interactions with various stakeholders that were concerned that they were seeing different attitudes amongst younger people entering the workforce in terms of wanting to take on responsibility, in terms of wanting to kind of drive forward with commitment that they saw that previous generations of Basques had. And so we did an analysis of this last year, and we found that yes, there are certain shifts in attitudes amongst younger people, which suggests that perhaps we need to address labour market challenges in different ways, and perhaps businesses also need to think about how they are making themselves attractive or not to younger people according to those different values and attitudes. And then finally, we analysed the economic structure in detail, and we saw that patterns of economic specialisation over the last 15 years have slowly been changing. Some strong clusters in the Basque Country are declining, other clusters are emerging. Particularly, we did an analysis of economic complexity, which showed, interestingly, and you can see in the 2 maps there, that whereas the complexity in manufacturing industry in the Basque Country has sustained itself and maintains as one of the leaders in complexity in Europe, in terms of complexity being the idea that you want to have industries that are specialized, but also that are specialized in areas where other regions are not specialized. So it's a mix of your specialization and the ubiquity of that specialization. We saw that the Basque Country performs very strongly in complexity of manufacturing industry, but it's lost a lot of complexity in the economy as a whole over the last decade or so, largely because the service industry is not performing so well, and there are certain key parts of services that have been declining over that time. So again, we use that to kind of make arguments and think about strategically with stakeholders around the links between manufacturing and services, how we strengthen some of those links, how we move towards the servitization of advanced manufacturing, etc. And finally, just to turn to this year's competitiveness report, on the next slide, you can see a very brief one part of the analysis of this year's competitiveness report. We've dedicated this year's report to analysing the levers, the green part of the framework, but specifically to analysing them through a lens of environmental sustainability. So how can each of those levers push us towards enhanced economic competitiveness and enhanced environmental sustainability, or are there trade-offs and contradictions between those 2 things? We analysed each of the 6 dimensions. And so, for example, in human capital, we looked at things such as green jobs and how they've been evolving. In infrastructure, we looked at the whole range of infrastructures that are important for sustainable transition. And in knowledge, we took a kind of fairly traditional analysis of knowledge as a driver for competitiveness, and we tried to inject some directionality into it and say, well, how is it a driver of green competitiveness? So we analysed knowledge inputs and outputs, traditional indicators of R&D spending, regional funding, patents, publications, etc. We analysed those through a green perspective, thematic focus of business R&D spending, of funding. The evolution of H2020 Europe, Horizon Europe funding, green patents, scientific publications related to the SDGs, etc. And again, through that, I think we're starting to get a more nuanced understanding of where the Basque Country is positioned in terms of how it can transform its industrial competitiveness into green competitiveness. You can see in the graph on the right, for example, that the Basque Country is pretty well positioned in terms of quality of scientific publications in the green area, particularly in SDGs related to sustainable cities and energy, which are 2 of the key industrial strengths of the Basque Country. So that for us is a positive sign. But then there are other areas where there are weaknesses that need to be addressed. So this is the kind of granularity we try to get into through analysis of the framework. And just to conclude on the next slide, just to mention that The framework itself and the way we apply it is very much living and evolving. So we're experimenting with it continually. We don't see it as something static. We see it as something that will change over time. We're using it to frame analysis for our competence report. So next year, we're going to explore the transversal dimension of gender and understand how gender relates to competitiveness in the Basque Country and across the whole different dimensions of the framework. We're also using it to guide dialogue with policymakers. So we have a very live dialogue with the Basque government at the moment around the strategy, a long-term strategy for the Basque Country through to 2040 and what the Basque Country wants to look like in 20 years' time. We support also reflections at different levels of analysis. So we're doing some city level analysis to try and understand whether the framework needs to change, whether different elements are important, more or less important, etc. And then we use it to frame research on a whole range of specific competitiveness levers in collaborative projects with a whole range of stakeholders around things such as skills, decarbonisation, finance, social capital, etc. And finally, we're also starting to use it, and this is a new thing that we've been experimenting with this year, to develop training programs to try and build policy capacities in the Basque Country and potentially elsewhere that are built around a common language of competitiveness for well-being and a common understanding of the different drivers that are there. And we've seen that this is something that in the Basque Country has traditionally been important in terms of building policy capacities both within government and outside of government, in businesses, in intermediary agencies, etc., that talk the same language and that have a common point of reference for their understanding of competitiveness, productivity, economic growth, etc. And I'll finish there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. Very well done. It is an amazing piece of work that you're doing. I think one of the two things that I wanted to pick up on, although everything is quite amazing, is this what you started with, is this striving for impact. Like, how can we do this stuff so that we have impact? And then you have this interaction with stakeholders to try to have more impact than just writing a report and then that ends up somewhere on the desk. So I think that's very interesting, probably something that we can discuss a little bit further in the panel discussion afterwards. And another thing, I mean, it's already in your title, but you have this competitiveness and this productivity. It's not an end in itself. It's something that is a tool or the main pathway for better lives for people. And I think that's very nice. And of course, that sounds very well for the OECD, where we have better policies for better lives. So I think that we're all aligned here with that objective. So thank you very much. I'll definitely will come back to some of the elements that you lined out here. Also, how much data work that is going behind the scene and trying to be able to make that as useful as possible for all the users of your reports and your analysis. So again, something that we'll probably be able to discuss a bit further towards the end. For now, I would like to invite Raquel to discuss the work that she has been leading on for the Productivity Institute.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see the slides. If you can maximize, perhaps.
Let me see. Can you see now? Better?
I still see the entire PowerPoint, not the slides, only the slides.
Yeah.
All right. Now we have to present the view, so we'll have to go to display settings on top. And then swap. Perfect.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the invitation today. Thank you very much, James. Very interesting presentation. Today, I'm going to present a product from the Data Lab. This product is the regional focus, and before going into the product, I would like to use a bit of framework of the Data Lab. And briefly before the product Data Lab sits at the product
Sorry, Raquel, the connection is very bad. We barely hear anything of your voice.
Okay.
Don't know whether there is, sound more like a connection issue then, but we see you well, so I'm not completely sure if there's anything we can do.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, so I don't know if we have to speak. Let's try a bit more, and otherwise we'll swap the presentation. We'll go first to Carlo, but maybe we'll try a bit.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, maybe now it's a bit better, and if you speak a bit louder, perhaps the microphone will pick it up a bit better.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, let's try.
Oh, now can you hear me better? So, as I was saying, the Productivity Lab sits at the Productivity Institute is a newly established institute. Well, it was established in 2020, and the Productivity Lab is the data science part. Sorry. Okay. So the Productivity Institute has, as you see, it's an institute of 32 million investment that has the headquarters at the University of Manchester, and with 10 institutional partners across the country, with stakeholders of around 250 grouped in 8 regional productivity forums covering the whole UK territory. The Productivity Institute laid the foundations of an era on sustained and inclusive productivity growth, and helped policymakers and business leaders, as I was mentioning before, across the UK to understand how to improve productivity and raise living standards. So the approaches are setting an agenda for the development of this productivity narrative, and working with firms and working with the stakeholders across the country, including policymakers. As I said before, the main levers of the Productivity Institute are the 8 regional forums, the productivity commissions, and some research themes that are evolving over time with new nexus themes across different areas of the productivity drivers. The Productivity Lab is the Data Science Center of Excellence at the Productivity Institute. So it is very much the hub for data-related activities, although many data-related activities are happening in the different projects and research programs. We try to disseminate, collect, and also produce data tools and data support facilities for the academics that works at TPI, and also for the stakeholders. The productivity, the UK TPI scorecards, more or less, they fit into different activities among the different areas of the Productivity Lab. Among the different areas, being a data hub, we create formal repositories of research data using Figshare, working with the university library, where we can really deposit data-related visualizations, data sets that are either being produced by the TPI researchers or by the data lab. We are also creating some support facility in data-related activities, such as researchers, regional productivity forums, or stakeholders. We are creating the web platforms in order to use the data tools. And of course, we are collaborating and creating partnerships with different stakeholders. So as you see, this product from the Productivity Lab really very much fits into very different activities that we are doing here at the Productivity Lab. As I said before, for this product, we have very closely worked with the TPI Regional Productivity Fora. The TPI Regional Productivity Fora are, as you see, covering different geographical areas across the country, and in some cases, they are not really very much covering administrative, as we will take. We will understand territorial units, statistical territorial units, as we understand. So all of these regional productivity fora have an academic lead institution within the geographical area. And we have been working closely with some of them in order to co-create these productivity scorecards. What I wanted to explain today as part of this presentation is that the productivity TPI scorecards have been developed in a process. So it has been a sequential process that different situations and different collaborations with different stakeholders somehow motivated the creation of a new data tool. So at the very beginning of this data production, Northern Ireland Regional Productivity Fora decided to put together a scorecard very much motivated by one of the publications of KPMG for Scotland. And then they decided to adapt this publication of this data tool for productivity drivers to the Northern Ireland kind of let's say, statistical kind of environment. Afterwards, given the interest of this Northern Ireland productivity scorecard, we decided to reproduce and also translate for all the ITL1 territorial areas in the UK to adapt the scorecard that Northern Ireland produced for all of these areas. I will explain later that part of the data lab activities are also producing some evidence coming up from the dissemination of different kind of data bases that they have been put together by official statistical offices, and we try to do it in a way that somehow it is a bit catchy. So we produced the London Effect blog that I'm going to comment in a second. And that also, it was very much a motivation to go a bit deeper, given the strong interregional and intra-regional also disparities that can be seen in the UK areas. So we work with the stakeholders in London and the South Regional Productivity Fora to develop other visualizations and all other data tools that allow intra-regional comparison between these ITL2 areas. And we develop by matter of consultation and engagement with the different regional productivity forum members, the ITL3 scorecard for London, and then afterwards the ITL3 scorecards for all the 179 ITL3 region grouped at the ITL1 level. So as I say, and you can have a look at the nice article put together in the annual review of the TPI Institute, the Northern Ireland scorecard really motivated, inspired somehow the data lab to reproduce that and translate as well, because as we know, the regional Northern Ireland Statistical Office has some indicators that are a bit different from the indicators that can be found across the UK. So we had to do a translation a bit of the drivers of productivity. The ITL1 productivity scorecards, I have to make a kind of a parenthesis, because the ITL1 productivity scorecards are the TL2 OECD administrative areas for the ones that are following. They have 5 main drivers of productivity. They focus on business performance, skill and training, policy and institutions, health and well-being, and investment in infrastructure. They cover areas such as James was talking about, for instance, the sport intensity, R&D intensity, other areas on skills, tertiary education, areas on policy and institutions, health and well-being, and investment. This is a summary table for all the ITL1 scorecards, and you can see that the coloring of our scorecards indicates whether the region performs higher than the UK ITL1 median in that particular indicator, average or lower. And the regional comparison between the different indicators clearly indicate areas of attention that they have to be taken either at the subnational level, if really this particular region is not performing very well in that indicator, or at the national level, if you can see that there is really an underperforming across all the regions in the country. For instance, an example, it can be that the percentage of training activities appear to be yellow, amber in most of the regions, indicating that perhaps this is an area that the national level should take into consideration. While in other cases, for instance, in the case of innovation activities, you can see that there is a very big disparity between them. So I was saying what it somehow motivated to go into a much higher disaggregation of the scorecards. It was our blog on analyzing the subnational productivity in the UK. So in this particular blog, what we focused, it was in the we tried to disseminate the ONS Subregional Productivity 2022 release. And for that, we decided to just do a very small analysis on what if we take into consideration the average of the UK productivity, taking into consideration London, or we extract London because, you know, London really overperforms other areas. And you can see that without excluding London in this hypothetical situation, many of the regions that appear here, it will have a much higher performance. Okay. And we also did an analysis looking at the levels and the change. So James was talking as well on taking into consideration not only the levels, but also the change. And we looked at the disparities at the ITL2 regional level. And we somehow indicated that having areas such as inner London, it really can somehow hide the productivity performance in other areas. So this motivated some of the regions at the subnational level in the London and the South Regional Productivity Forum to come to us and say, well, you know, we are in London, but actually our regions in London, our local areas in London are underperforming the regional UK average. Therefore, looking at the ITL1 level is really hiding these intra-regional, you know, differences between our areas in the ITL1 regional in London. So, and you can see how, for instance, ITL scorecards in the ITL London and the South Regional Productivity Forum, it really present very different performance of the different indicators. For that, we went a bit deep and we analyzed engaging with the stakeholders, with different stakeholders, not only from the kind of policymakers, but also from academia. And we start doing an analysis more in depth for that pilot, the London and the South Forum. As you can see, you know, some areas here are not only belonging to the Southwest, that is one of the lower performing areas, but also some of them, they belong to actually the London areas. So local areas in London really underperform the UK average. And this is for, this was the really motivation to create a new tool, an ITL3 scorecard, as a tool for comparative analysis. And for doing that, we really had to translate the different dimensions. So the UK ITL3 productivity scorecards indicators, they cover the 12 UK ITL1 subnational areas and 179 UK ITL local areas. And they are produced from 2019, 2020, and 2021, so very recent data. And they allow, you know, comparisons in drivers on productivity, such as the taxonomy relative to the UK or the taxonomy relative to the ITL1 or GBA per hour work. But also they look at business performance, skill and training, areas of health and well-being, such as economic inactivity or inactivity due to illness, and areas that some stakeholders found that they were very important to create business case to receive some funding from the government, investments, infrastructures, and connectivity. So this driver, it is a bit more extended at the ITL3 level than at the ITL1 level because of the particular interest of the local areas in having a much better, illustration of infrastructures in that particular local area. I think I'm going to stop here. I have some slides, but because of the technicalities, I think I'm going to stop here so I can come up later in the discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Raquel. I think it's, the technicality from the beginning afterwards was perfect, so no problems there whatsoever. It's an interesting pathway that you are presenting, right? We're starting with individual reports, perhaps from another organization for one region, say first for Scotland and then for Northern Ireland, and then trying to generalize that, and then trying to go deeper. So going from ITL1, so this is the TL2 region of the OECD, going to TL3, and perhaps even, maybe there's demand for you going even deeper in the future, because there's still always more inequality to try to unpack. And I suppose that is going to be also an interesting conceptual discussion. How deep does it make sense to go if you want to create some productivity statistics and understand the drivers? Because in the end, there's also a lot of interaction between regions. So it's not anymore about what you have in your own place, but also what maybe your neighbors are having and how that interact with each other. So I think that's going to be the next challenge for all of us to try to drive a bit further. You did a lot of work, clearly, right? Trying to get all these statistics together. So that's it. I think that's something that we are very happy to see, right? From the Spatial Productivity Lab and the whole family of Center for Entrepreneurship Region Cities, that we are getting more and more into understanding what happens at the regional level. So I'm very glad to see that the way that you can contribute to that.
Yeah. My last slide was pointing to anyone interested to visit our website and also our Figshare repository, where not only the data or the scorecards in PDFs, but also the visualizations that we are using in blogs are also sitting there for anyone that wants to use it. Yeah, absolutely. So we'll be sharing the link to such places as well in the summary report that we'll make after this. And the same for Orchestra. They also have a brilliant dashboard that everyone can explore. It's not only about what happens in Basque Country, but what happens across the European Union. So that's this kind of different repositories with visualizations that are attached to it. They're very exciting developments. So it's very nice. All right, let's move to the next presentation, where we're going to have Carlo talking about the productivity review of Trentino that we have been working on over the past months. Carlo, to you.
Thank you very much, Wessel. Very happy to share some of the work that we are doing together here in Trentino within the context of the local productivity board. So we can move to the next slide, and I'm happy to virtually welcome you to Trento and Trentino. So just to provide you a bit of context, Trentino is a mountainous region in the northeast of Italy, hosting around 500,000 people. Is well known for its generally high standard of living, even compared to the generally wealth north of Italy. And another important characteristic is its autonomous nature. So it's part of 5 of the 20 Italian regions who have a high level of devolved local power. Trentino can retain most of the taxes that are most of the local fiscal revenues. So they have a much larger autonomy in terms of a much larger budget than the average Italian region. Another asset of Trentino is that there is an OECD branch located here since around 20 years. It's a small but dynamic office that works in the area of local economic development, both in terms of data analysis and research and also of capacity building. So we try to translate our activity, our research into wider and stronger capacity for local practitioners across the OECD. So not only locally, but across the whole OECD countries. And part of this team is the OECD Spatial Productivity Lab, to which Wessel and I contribute, with a special focus on productivity of places and on policies to support to boost local productivity, leveraging also the collaboration with a network of more than 15 partners, including Orchestra and the TPI. Next slide, please. So why a place like Trentino should be concerned about productivity? Because it's well known to be a relatively wealthy region. Well, there was a general perception, in some cases also a concrete awareness, that despite being a wealthy region, is somehow losing ground with some of the neighbors or some of other similar regions across the Europe and the OECD. So we tried to understand how we could translate this into data, and we found a very simple visualization based on the identification of 10 peer regions using very simple criteria to select the regions that have a similar level of GDP per worker, a very basic measure of productivity in year 2000, and that the similar size of Trentino, and were located outside Italy because there's already a lot of work comparing Trentino with Italy, so it was beyond our scope of analysis. And what we see that before 2000, actually, this very simple selection criteria do a very good job in identifying regions that have a very similar trend. But at the beginning of 2000, we see that there is the pattern start to diverge, and we see that using the most recent available data, we see there's a gap of around 25% in terms of productivity with regions that were very similar a couple of decades ago. So that was motivated the local council. We can move to the next slide to create through legislation a local productivity board or local productivity commission. I would like to emphasize that is to the best of our knowledge, the first case in Italy, probably one of the, with such a setting, probably also one of the first cases across OECD. And it also, you may be aware that Italy doesn't even have a national productivity commission. So we could say that probably the first productivity board or productivity commission in Italy. It is actually not a coincidence because of the autonomous nature of the province of Trentino. It's not the first time that the region is a bit of a policy laboratory where actually some innovative initiatives are experimented, and then maybe they are replicated across the country. The initiative has a 3-year mandate, but we are asked to report periodically, both in terms of written analysis and also in terms of opportunities for local consultation and local discussions. And then I think another peculiar aspect, another asset of the initiative is the fact that it's a very participated initiative, and I will show it better in the next slide. So the activities is supported both by a scientific committee and a group of local stakeholders, and we at the OECD Spatial Productivity Lab are coordinating and we interact with the local subnational government. And finally, I think Raquel highlighted very well how important it is to have a very good underlying data infrastructure to build upon. And I think you saw another very strong asset that we interact very closely with the local statistical offices. There is a provincial branch of the national of Italian statistical offices that is extremely supportive. And we managed they manage with our support to create a shared database that includes some administrative microdata sources that are provided by other local partners, such as the local employment agencies. So this really gives us a boost in terms of analysis we can do. And talking about that, we can move to the next slide, which give a better visualization of the participated nature of the initiative. So the OECD Spatial Productivity Lab has a double role of interacting with the subnational government, also to coordinate both the activity of the stakeholder group. They play an advisory role and include the trade associations, the labor unions, the employer association. I think very remarkable to see how they really, all of them are very constructive approach. We're very interested in understanding what can be done to support the productivity at the local level. And we have the labor unions and the employer association sitting together at the same table and pretty much agreeing on many of the things that were discussed. So that was really also an asset of the social capital that you can find in a region like Trentino. And on the other hand, we also coordinate the activities of a scientific committee. Scientific committee has more substantial role of providing more substantial analysis, includes 6 institutions that have a strong research capacity inside them. So include the local research department of the Bank of Italy, the Chamber of Commerce, the Employment Agency, the local statistical office that I mentioned earlier, some researchers from the University of Trento who are strong expertise on productivity, and then a research branch of a big local foundation that is specialized in evaluation of public policies. So we can move to the next slide. This, after I heard James talking, we want to redraw the slides because the process, as he emphasized, is not linear, so we should not have a narrow, but more like a circle here. But this details the activities that we are tasked to do. So there is a part that is and is empirical analysis with the objective to widen the evidence base to support better informed local productivity policies. But this also builds upon the interaction, the consultation with the local stakeholders that can give a lot of help for the interpretation and providing context to our empirical findings. We then have opportunity to exchange, to interact not only with the stakeholders in the stakeholder group, but more broadly with all the economic system of the region. And then based on all this analysis, interaction, we can eventually provide some policy recommendation to the provincial council that, as I mentioned before, has a more room to maneuver than the average OECD region. So if we give them the right policy recommendation, we can really have an impact in the productivity of the region. We can move to the next slide. So now I would like just to give a flavor of some very preliminary analysis that we are doing that will contribute to the empirical approach. I would really emphasize that we should not focus on the findings because the super preliminary, we start this work late spring. So it's really, but just on the type of approach that you will see is quite aligned to what the orchestra and the TPI are doing. So we can move to the slide. So if you remember, we had to identify some of the reasons behind the gap that Trentino accumulated with the peer regions. So we're not reinventing the wheel. You can see that is very similar to what we learned a lot from orchestra and TPI. So we're adopting a very similar approach. So we compare Trentino with the peer regions across a number of different productivity drivers. Here you see labor market. We consider also research, innovation, skill and talents, business dynamics. So the drivers that have been identified also by our partners. We compare Trentino with peers, with the most recent data, and then over the last 5 or 10 years, and the example of the labor market. So we use indicators available from OECD database, Eurostat, and whenever useful, we also try to use microdata to build additional indicators if we want to focus on something specific, which I think is important, maybe because the stakeholders emphasize as something that should be investigated. So for example, here you see that Trentino is doing quite well in ensuring that the unemployment rate is low, even through periods of recessions. However, we see there is some missed potential in terms of participation of the female labor force, and also across the whole spectrum of the different occupations. For example, we also calculate the share of female managers using the labor force survey microdata, and we see that Trentino is quite lagging behind compared to peers. We can move to the next slide, in which we can show that we also try to use more detailed sector and firm level data to identify a bit better where the gap in the private sector may be. Here you see a diagram where the height of the bar is the productivity level in 2001 or 2019 respectively, and the width of the bar is the share of the sector in the local economy, comparing Trentino with peers. So the couple of indications of this chart, again, everything quite preliminary, but we see that productivity has some potential to fill in the productivity gap of Trentino compared to the peer regions in 2 ways. First of all, we see that productivity growth has been faster in the peer regions compared to Trentino over the last 20 years, and also the share of productivity of manufacturing, on general, the tradable sector in the Trentino economy is still lower. So we see the bar is slimmer in Trentino than the peer regions. So there is also some potential probably to expand the tradable sector, which we know is typically important to drive productivity growth in a region. On the other side, we see that the the biggest, largest sector in Trentino. Trade hospitality service is a sector that has quite a low productivity level compared to the tradable sector, and also have experienced very little productivity growth both in Trentino and the peer regions. We can move to the next slide, which show a bit more experimental work using microdata from level microdata. Here, the comparison with the peer regions is a bit more delicate due to the methodological reason, but we still find an interesting result that seems quite robust. So here is a focus on manufacturing, distinguishing between medium high tech and medium low tech manufacturing. What we see that in Trentino, the productivity of the bottom 50% of companies, of the least productive 50% companies, is quite comparable with the peer region. What is really missing is the top 25%, top 10% frontier firms, which are much more productive in the peer regions than in Trentino. And when we look at the data a bit further, see that it's really driven by the large manufacturing firms that in Trentino are fewer and are also less productive than elsewhere. Again, this is something that we still need to entirely investigate, but I think give a hint of the type of analysis that we are aiming to do. I think we can conclude with the next slide, which show some other, just give a flavor of the other areas of analysis that we want to investigate over the next couple of years. So the idea that we start with a general analysis, that we move into something a bit more thematic, building upon the consultation with the stakeholders and also the ideas of our partners in the scientific board. Some of the ideas that are floating around is a focus on the productivity of micro firms. In Trentino, the share of micro firms is much higher than in the peer regions and general across the OECD. So I think it's quite crucial to understand which are the micro firms that are more productive and whether they scale up or not, whether the most productive firms that grow or not. Then another key point that we emerged from our preliminary analysis, that in Trentino we have a very low level of people with tertiary education, and more generally, there's a clear problem in retaining. There's a very dynamic university, but a lot of graduates tend to move elsewhere after so this seems to be another challenge for the region. So not only attracting, but also retaining skilled workers. And then there's an interest on the role that decentralized bargaining can have to improve productivity in a region that has quite some different characteristics and cost of living and wage levels compared to the rest of Italy. And as you may know, Italy is a country that is typically characterized by quite strong centralized bargaining. I think I can stop here.
Thank you, Carlo. I can say very interesting presentation, but I was partly responsible for that, so that's not very nice. I think like one thing that we wanted to show here as well is how we are all building on each other's work, right? So we are definitely looking at, we have been looking, of course, at what Orchestra has already been doing and what TPI has already been doing. And yeah, not reinventing the wheel, as Carlo said, right? How are we going to, we can complement and we can innovate, but we also do it in small steps, but taking the frameworks that are already there. Some of the visualizations, of course, are just the right way of doing it. So there's no reason to do it certainly in a very different ways. So yeah, we are trying to really to build on the work that has already been done in other places. So we have plenty of time still for a panel discussion. And what I would like to do is actually go to two questions that are posted in the Q&A, and they're a bit related to each other. So I'll just first pose both of them, and then maybe make a summary out of them, and then ask James and Maria, Jose and Raquel, and then Carlo to intervene, and Rudiger, of course, has joined us as well. So the first question was basically for Raquel, is like, how did you decide on the geographical granularity? So you have ITL1 regions, and then we move to ITL2 regions, but they don't always have the same powers in terms of policymakers. So how relevant is it to have productivity statistics for a set administrative region if it's not necessarily related to administrative powers or an economic kind of unit? So I think that is that's definitely an interesting question that we all probably are trying to deal with, because we are also part of a bigger whole, or every region that we are organizing or analyzing is part of a bigger whole. And then the second question from Dimitri Korpakis is how do you factor in that there is a whole world out there, right? What are the macroeconomic and political environment that is probably fixed at a much higher level, still has an effect on productivity, but maybe there's not so much that you can do at the local level about it. So there is these two things I think are related to each other. Like, what is the level of the geographical level that we analyze, given that there is something bigger out there, and how relevant is that for policymaking? So we have Basque Country and Trentino, a bit more autonomous in terms of the administrative powers, but in UK it's organized again differently. So it's a valid question to ask. So maybe James and Marie-José, maybe you want to start, and then I'll move to Raquel.
You want to start?
Yeah, maybe. On the issue of the functional economic areas and the granularity question, in our case, what we have is the regional level, the geographical way, but also the provincial level. The 3 provincial councils have quite many competencies on economic and competitiveness issues. So they are defining different policies that can help also to foster the competitiveness, especially of SMEs. And even there are other levels, which are the cities, but also the counties, which are the groups of different municipalities that are working especially with very small firms. So we do research adapted to each political area. And we have the flexibility that we have is easier to get because the relationship that we have with the statistical office of the Basque Country. So we can group the different indicators of different municipalities regarding the needs that we have at political level. So this is the response that we are working with. But this is an issue for us because there are several policies that are defined at regional levels, but the fiscal capacity is at provincial level, for instance. So all the fiscal policies are defined at the provincial level too. So this issue of granularity is important in our case, and the relationship with the statistical office gives us a lot of flexibility to do very adaptive analysis to each case.
And it's related also with the selection of indicators. In the indicators that we use in our competitiveness report for the results and that are in our observatory are indicators that are comparable across EU regions, because we want to for that report and for that observatory, we think that the comparative nature is particularly important. But we have issues in that there are other indicators available at local level which add further light onto various questions. And so when we write our reports, we tend to start with the comparative indicators, and then we introduce another level of indicators that we can't compare. We can maybe compare with other autonomous regions in Spain, or we can maybe compare at national level but not at regional level. And so we kind of use an approach that's fairly flexible to according to the different needs. And just to respond to Dimitri's question on the international political environment, that's a debate that we've long had in Orchestra as well. When we were thinking about and designing a framework over recent years, we're very aware that there's a macroeconomic context that sits outside of our regional model. But I think the way we approach it is in how we interpret the results. So, for example, during the last few years, where we've seen big impacts of the pandemic and then the geopolitical instability, etc., that comes through in many of the indicators. And so when we're analysing what's happening in the Basque Country, we refer back to what's happening internationally. So it's more, I think, in the analysis and the interpretation that we bring that in. For example, in this year's competitiveness report, we're analysing the green transition. And of course, that's an area where European regulation is absolutely critical. So we have a whole chapter of the report that's dedicated to understanding the European and national context and how the Green Deal, the raft of regulations coming through that are changing the competitiveness outlook for Basque firms. So we kind of go into it in more of a qualitative sense, I guess, than in a quantitative sense in terms of our frame.
Right, very good. Raquel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart and Dimitri. Stuart, I think that your question, it is even more difficult to answer for me because the UK TPI has 8 regional productivity forums, and the regional productivity forums actually they don't overlap with administrative areas. So, for instance, the example I have put in the presentation, it was London and the South, and London and the South have 3 different ITL 1 areas, Tier 2 OECD areas, and therefore it makes very difficult statistically to be able to provide with a kind of a regional productivity for a scorecard. The fact of being Northern Ireland, the one who provided the first one, Northern Ireland has a kind of the Board of Administration statistical office. So for them, it was very easy to compile a series of indicators to illustrate that vision. When we were asked to reproduce them for other regional productivity forums, it was a very big question mark about what the end user of these scorecards was really in need to have, right? So I think that some of the regional productivity forum members, they do understand that they have been put together geographically because of certain, let's say, maybe causes, but administratively and in terms of policy-driven strategy, having at the regional productivity forum a kind of abstract or hybrid geographical levels scorecards, it was not very much used. And also statistically, to get indicators and be able to update this information, it was much easier to do it at the ITL 1 level, you know. So some visualizations we provide for them, including the different ITL 1s for the regional productivity forums. But the majority of the stakeholders, they prefer to have ITL 1 scorecards and now ITL 3 scorecards. As you say, this is an administrative level that is more connected with the administrative power that they have in certain areas to really influence policy. So they would like to somehow compete for having funding under the ITL 1 level, you know. So you have peer-to-peers that they belong to the same ITL 1 level, that they would like to create a business case for them to ask for funding on infrastructures, on skills, and therefore for them it was really very useful to have an ITL 1, you know, administrative level scorecard to be able to compare themselves within the ITL 1 region, within London, but also at the ITL 3 level with other areas that sit in other ITL 1 regions, like maybe in Greater Manchester or something like that. So that was the main reason for, and I completely understand that, to be fair, the UK administrative levels is very, very difficult to cope up with if you are not from the UK. So it took me many years to understand the administrative system, the UK.
But I can imagine that it is, your stakeholders are not only policymakers, right? These are also local businesses and the private sector. So perhaps they can also do stuff that is not necessarily dependent on what the government is doing, but still with the indicators in their community, they can devise some initiatives based on the analysis that you're producing.
Absolutely, yes, I think so. I mean, maybe some private sector that want to see how, you know, the macroeconomic conditions at the ITL 3 level are somehow developing over time. They will use these tools to think about where they were and they where are, and which other areas are potential areas for, you know, skill attraction and things like that. So I think that you're completely right. I think it's not only policymakers. Another thing is that they also, and this links with Dimitri and also the answer by James, they were very much interested in having more than 1 year. So we produced a snapshot of 2019. 2020 data, it was very difficult to understand, I have to say. So then it was much better to wait until the release of 2021 to have, you know, a much better idea of what has happening and how the pandemic has affected all of these different drivers of productivity. So yes, the macroeconomic conditions are affecting local areas very differently. And I think that you have to have a much longitudinal, kind of data to understand how these areas are, how resilient they are, how prepared they are for, so I think that slowly, I mean, we are very new, so slowly we are trying to create a tool that is of use for many different stakeholders, as you say, and try to contemplate a bit the effect of these macroeconomic conditions within the different local areas in the UK.
Thank you very much. Carlo, I think you also want to come in.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think we should really think for each driver we are looking at, which is the best spatial scale we should look at, all right? So for example, we are talking about attracting FDI, probably this is a regional strategy, but for other, think about productivity in the tourism, we know that even within Trentino, there are large differences just across different valleys. And then and I think we can also learn a lot from that, right? Because within the same regions, we see that there are quite some differences to really point to something that is feasible in the short term to adjust, right? We see that, for example, a valley has a much stronger tourism sector than another valley with maybe a similar level of amenities. Then this point to some immediate policy action that can be taken. Of course, the challenge there is sometimes getting data that are granular enough, but that's something that is indeed crucial to keep in mind. And then in terms of some factors that are national, other factors that are regional, we also know that the so-called mega trends have a very different impact across regions and places depending on the underlying characteristic of the place, right? So of course there is little that Trentino or another small region can do about the increase in gas prices, but there is some local characteristic of Trentino that make it much more vulnerable to or less vulnerable to such mega trend. So this is where we can provide some useful indication to the local policymakers.
Great, thank you. And there are some very interesting questions in the Q&A. So I just wanted to, I'm just going to go through the list. I think the first question that I see here from Vicky is specifically about skills, but we can take it a bit broader. The question is, how can we go from the productivity analysis that we're doing in terms also the scorecards and the indicator visualization of a building towards actually changing policy on the ground? So she asked explicitly, like in our case, it took a long process to reform the public skills training providers because it requires training the trainers and then establishing training facilities and curriculum and so on. So how do you actually get to impact? I guess that's the main question here, is specifically about skills, but of course we can do it a bit broader. But for those that have some experience already, it might be interesting to tell something about how you go from where we started to where we're going.
Yeah, in our case, we have a specific experience, but not with universities, but with
vocational training.
Vocational training. Yeah, I couldn't get the name because for instance, in the case of Bilbao city, there is an evolution towards a much more servitization of the economy, and there were some talent or some skills that were lacking on the city. So we were developing a project with the city council in which we identified the lack of skills in some areas, working with the vocational training responsible at the Basque government. We defined with some vocational training centers some specific programs very focused on the service issues, but we didn't do an analysis of the impact of skills on the productivity, but we see on the relationship with the stakeholders a lack on skills, and develop a process with the vocational training centers on this. But that is because they are much more flexible. They are also doing a lot of dual training on in collaboration with firms, so they identify the needs much faster than other kind of training centers too. So in the vocational training is easier in our case than in the universities, for instance.
Raquel, yeah, you wanted to.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that in the case of skills, I mean, you need to understand a bit of the data tool that I was presenting today is a data tool for comparative purposes. So here I was in a small chat we had before with the presenters. I was talking about that some of the tools that OECD has put forward, European Commission, big macro country institutions, they tend to be like top-down tools, isn't it? Tools for comparative purposes and tools that they have some dynamicity, but maybe at the short term level, 3 years, 5 years. Some of the tools that Carlo, I think they are putting forward, or Marijo and James, are more bottom-up tools that allows, to have a much better granularity and be very, very tailor-made to the actually industrial structure of the place, or the tissue of educated workforce. And I think that it is very important to take into consideration what a tool can do, right? In the case of the TPI UK productivity scorecards, I think that it is a tool that allows to have an image of what is happening, right? And the way that we sometimes present it to stakeholders is we take all of this each PDFs and they put it in one just slide for them to see how they perform over time, and they see themselves that maybe if every single region in a country is underperforming in that particular indicator, then, it brings the alarm for the central government to do something, to implement something across all the region, and maybe tailor-made afterwards, but in the first instance, I think that it should be the central government who is doing something, right? But as Marijo say, I think that tailor-made, skill programs that they link to places are very important for the resilience over time, as you were saying, So I think that all the tools that they take into consideration more, how are, the scenario buildings of having more skills in a particular area and things like that, maybe they are better fit, or bottom-up tools like Carlo is doing with microdata, they are maybe better fit than this kind of top-down official administrative open data tools that they have, of course, the limitation of the granularity for these local labor market, characteristics.
Great, thank you very much. There are 2 more questions, but I think we'll have to skip them. They're also, Raquel, you already partly answered them. They're really about like, how do you prioritize between all the, say, the 40 indicators that Orchestra has been putting together? Like, which one is the most important? And can we then? But in the end, it's about seeing the overall picture, right? And seeing to what extent that things are also interacting with each other. And it's probably for every region there is also a bit of a case-by-case analysis about which indicator is more important or some indicators are more important than for others. James, very briefly, and then I really want to move on to the future activities that we should cover.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, I think that our analysis, we've had, I think you'd say, some certain pressure over years to take a more directive kind of index-based approach to try and really understand and come up with regional competitiveness in indexes. We've always resisted that, I think, because I think that the holistic view of looking at a dashboard of different indicators and seeing how they are changing over time allows for a much more nuanced analysis. Of course, once you do that analysis, you do identify certain dimensions that are more or less important, but they're very contextual and they depend a lot also on what's happening in the macroeconomic environment that we've just talked about. So it's difficult to pinpoint, I think, one thing and say, well, this is the indicator that's driving regional productivity in the Basque Country or elsewhere. I think the analysis is far more complex than that, I think one of the things that we certainly have on our research agenda is to get a better understanding of the linkages between indicators through correlation analysis, through econometric analysis, etc. But it's I don't see that as a kind of a wonderful solution that's going to take us directly to the answers. But it is an important research question, so it's something that we're definitely working on.
I think it's excellent. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, we are also having a huge demand at this moment from parents and public administration and so on on projects related with talent, which are the main questions about the lack of talent and skills in some areas. But on this case, the problem is not only to know how are the indicators, but is to address this challenge, because it's a very complex challenge in which the companies needs to work together with universities, vocational training centers, policymakers. And for instance, we are developing at this moment a project with the Provincial Council of Vizcaya, which is the commitment with the talent, which is the shared commitment with the talent, in which we are developing different actions. Some of them are developed by universities, others by vocational training centers, others by firms, but there is a multidimensional project because the firms are working on the employer branding issue, for instance. The government is working on the place branding, and also on how to attract people at the other aspects of housing and so on. And the centers and the vocational training and university centers are developing new programs that are needed to address the lack of the talent. So there is not just one solution, one policy solution for this problem, because there is a multidimensional aspect, and many of the actors are doing things connected with this issue. But this hasn't come from this analysis of the competitiveness report. This comes more from the dialogue with the different stakeholders. So it's much more a specific problem that brings from the context. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. So last question before we ask Rudiger to give his closing remarks and summarize a little bit what we learned today is, what is up in the next few weeks? So you were shown what we have done in the past years and months. What is next? Raquel, please.
Yes, from the lab, I have presented this activity. We are doing things with quarterly data, so going into the years. But I think that what I would like to say today, we launched this ITL3 scorecards yesterday, so everybody can go to the website and the Figshare repository to download all these 3 years ITL1 with this aggregation at the ITL3 scorecards. And in November is the National Productivity Week of the Productivity Institute, and we are going to launch dashboards for every stakeholder or every every user that would like to do visualizations with the data behind the scorecards to play a bit with the dashboards and really create visualizations that they can use in the day-to-day reports or strategies or anything. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks. James and Joe, briefly, please.
Yeah, very briefly. No, we, as I mentioned, our competence report, this year's competence report, will be launched on the 20th of November. We have a conference here, and then we'll also be able to share all of that analysis online from that date. And then alongside that, we're working on next year's report already around gender to try and we're quite excited about bringing a gender dimension to the analysis of all these different drivers of competitiveness. And then other projects such as zooming in on particular dimensions. The skills talent is an area where I would say roughly 1/3 of our projects are working on in some aspect or another at the moment, reflecting the importance that have come through in some of the comments as well about this issue. So that's where we are, I think.
All right, thank you very much. Rudiger, please close for us.
Okay, thanks. I am very honored to be basically closing this very interesting meeting. I think what it has really been shown with all the 3 contributions that we saw is the great value that we can get from having more granular analysts doing that at the regional level. And what we saw today, we basically had 2 examples of 2 regions where this has been done, and we had 1 example where this has been done for all the regions in the UK at different levels of granularity as well. So basically, one of the questions that you may be thinking about, which geographies should one targeting when doing this more granular analysis at the regional level? And one thing that I realized, and that also Wessel referred to already, is basically those regions we talked about today are regions which are having a bit of a special status within their countries. So on the one hand, that may give them more resources and more freedom to do these things, but maybe also gives them more responsibility and more feeling that they really want to be taking their future in their own hands. And so, I mean, in a way, governance structures may also matter for productivity outcomes. And that's something that we haven't really been talking about and which is very hard to quantify. But I mean, it's probably not a coincidence that we had two regions which had higher levels of autonomy who are basically, I mean, leading on these, basically making a productivity analysis of the regions. Then one of the issues that came out of the discussion as well is one of the advantages of doing something at the regional level is there's certain data you can get for your region which you can't get for a lot of other ones, or which you can't get at the national level. So there's clearly a level of granularity here, which you can't have at other dimensions. And it also was clear from what we heard from Raquel is doing this analysis at different levels of TL, basically, or ITL, how you call them in the UK, has different advantages and also obviously different drawbacks. But I mean, it's still interesting to look at this in different dimensions. And maybe also one of the things we learned when you're doing productivity analysis, I mean, we are very much, pushing for having, the right borders for doing things, which are not necessarily the administrative borders, but when you're doing this productivity analysis, following the administrative border clearly seems to make your life a lot easier. Then what I also found interesting is basically kind of not only which geographies, but also who to compare with. And here we had two interesting ways of doing it. The first one was basically comparing your region to a number of peer regions. And the second one was to basically exclude the best performer, which I found interesting because sometimes when you're seeing like analysis of regions and countries, you get the impression it's kind of like, London against everybody else, or Paris against all the other parts of France. And by basically, taking, the most productive places out of the analysis, in a way, you may be seeing a nuance that you're missing, because in the other, when you're having them in, then basically, they're overshadowing everything, and you're not really seeing kind of like the shades of gray or blue and lila in those charts that you can see where once you're going beyond that. So I thought that was a very worthwhile exercise, and something that maybe we in the OECD will also be using in certain instances going forward. And then the third question is basically, not only which geographies, what to compare with, but also what to look at. And here, I thought the competitiveness for well-being approach was very nice from the Basque Country, because at the end of the day, we don't want productivity just for the sake of productivity, and also politically speaking, when you're trying to sell productivity just for productivity's sake, you're not going to get politicians very excited. But when you kind of like, basically make the link with well-being, I think that it's politically much easier sale. And I also really like the scorecards, and maybe that's also a model that we can be using a bit or something similar in the OECD going forward. Then what I also almost done. What I also found very interesting is that which was brought up by James, is that they are trying to go beyond just technical reports and have a more interactive research where they are bringing in other actors. And I think that's an approach we also in the OECD very much agree with, and where we're trying to move in this direction. Is obviously not always so easy, and being in the region, I think probably also is a huge asset advantage in the sense, and that's also what our Trento Centre is doing. But maybe with virtual meetings that these days, have become much easier, maybe that's something that has also become more feasible going forward. So basically just kind of like drawing all this together, when we were looking at these regional analysis, we saw that generally speaking, there's not, a region where everything is great or everything is horrible, but usually you have shadow and light. And doing this analysis, you get a very nuanced picture which then I think is really useful for policy making, because you get a good understanding which are the areas where you need to do some work and which are the areas where maybe, things are pretty okay and maybe it's not where you should be focusing on at the moment. Maybe there's more urgent things to do. And then again, kind of like comes back, what I started with is kind of like the strengths of the more granular analysis. I mean, that has been shown by these 3 presentations, and that really is important. And that's basically why we should be trying to do more of that going forward. And thanks to everybody for this really fascinating webinar and with excellent presentations and also very interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you very much also from me. Thank you, James, Maria-Jose, Raquel, Carlo, for all your presentations, and the audience, of course, for watching, and hope to see you soon in the next one. Goodbye, everyone.